Hello, my name is Caroline George, and today I will be talking about the East India Company. While based in London, they had a global impact with trading in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As you go through my presentation, click on the red dot in the lower right-hand corner in order to start me speaking. I am going to start with the origin of the East India Company, also called the English East India Company, as there was the Dutch East India Company from the Netherlands. For our sake, however, we are going to refer to the English version when I say East India Company. The goal of the company was to exploit the trade with East and Southeast Asia, as well as India, for the gains of England. Until 1588, when the Spanish Armada was defeated, the Spanish and the Portuguese had a monopoly of the trade. The victory by England allowed for them to break that monopoly. The East India Company received their royal charter on December 31st, 1600, from Queen Elizabeth I. From then until 1612, each voyage that went out was separately endorsed, and the voyages were separate from each other. From the start of the East India Company to 1657, there were only temporary joint stocks. After 1657, however, a permanent joint stock was made. To the left is an image, a drawing of the East India House in London by Thomas Homser Shepherd in 1817. The East India Company faced opposition from the Dutch and the Portuguese in Asia. From the Dutch, the English were excluded from the East Indies after the Ambonia Massacre. The massacre took place in Ambonia, which is now Ambon, Indonesia, in 1623, when local Dutch authorities put 10 Englishmen, 10 Japanese, and a Portuguese man to death. It was believed by the local Dutch governor that the men were colluding to kill him and overwhelm the Dutch garrison. The men pleaded guilty after being tortured. After this incident, there was no hope that the English and the Dutch would cooperate in this area. This limited their ability to trade in the East Indies. However, prior to the Ambonia Massacre in 1612, the company had defeated the Portuguese in India. They won the trading abilities with the Mughal Empire. The company traded cotton and silk piece goods, indigo, saltpeter, and spices from South India. The East India Company was able to extend its activities to the Persian Gulf, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. The East India Company began using slave labor in the early 1620s. People were enslaved mostly from East Africa, specifically Mozambique and Madagascar, as well as Indonesia and West Africa, and they were transported to facilities in Southeast Asia, India, and the Americas. Large-scale transportation of enslaved people was most prominent from the 1730s to the early 1750s. It finally ended in the 1770s. After the mid-18th century, cotton good trades decreased, while there was an increase in need for tea in England. To compensate, the East India Company started financing the tea trade with opium exports instead of cotton goods at the beginning of the 19th century. However, China opposed this trade as opium was illegal in their country, which caused both the First and Second Opium Wars. The First Opium War began after the exportation of opium, which was primarily being exported from India, increased dramatically in the 1820s. This increase caused widespread addiction in China, causing social, economic, and health problems for the people. In the spring of 1839, the Chinese government confiscated and destroyed more than 20,000 chests, which is about 1,400 tons of opium, that were being warehoused in Canton by British merchants. After this and one more incident in July, the hostility between the two sides increased until fighting broke out at the end of the year. The war lasted about 2 years and ended with the Treaty of Nanjing, which was signed on August 29, 1842. The treaty said that China had to pay Britain a large sum of money, as well as give them Hong Kong and an increased number of treaty ports, which allowed Britain to trade more freely in China. Once Britain was given these extra port treaties, other Western countries wished to have the same and were granted similar privileges. The second incident began in the mid-1850s. The British wanted to increase their trading rates in China, so they were looking to renew hostilities with the country. In October 1856, some Chinese officers boarded the British ship Arrow, which was docked in Canton, and arrested several crew members and supposedly lowered the British flag. This is where the other name for the incident of the Arrow War comes from. Later that month, a British warship began bombarding Canton as it sailed up Pearl River estuary. This caused skirmishes to break out between the Chinese and the British. The skirmishes ended in a stalemate, and because of this, trading was stopped. Tensions escalated in December when Chinese that were in Canton burned trading warehouses. Military operations began in late 1857 with the British being allied with the French. They didn't start until late 1857, however, because the British were dealing with the Indian Mutiny. Two different sets of treaties were signed in 1858. The first, signed in June 1858 in Tianjin, provided residence for foreign envoys in Beijing, more ports being opened for Western trade and residence, the right for foreign travel in the interior of China, and the freedom of movement for Christian missionaries. The second set of negotiations happened in Shanghai, where they legalized the importation of opium. The treaties were not ratified until the end of 1860, when the British and French captured Beijing. That month, the Beijing Convention was signed, in which the Chinese government agreed to observe the treaties and give the British the south portion of Kowloon Peninsula, which is adjacent to Hong Kong. The original East India Company faced opposition to its monopoly, which led to the establishment of a rival company and the fusion of the two in 1708. They became the United Company of Merchants of England. The company, however, lost commercial and political control after the Regulating Act of 1773 and William Pitt the Younger's India Act in 1784. Those acts established governmental control of political policy by a regulating board which was responsible to Parliament. It lost its commercial monopoly in 1813, and then from 1834 until the Indian Mutiny in 1857, its entire role was to stand as a managing agency for the British government in India. It legally stopped existing in 1873. The goals of the East India Company changed drastically over the 200 plus years that it was in service. What initially started as a monopolistic trading company turned more into a political act for the British government. It acted as an agent for British imperialism in India from the 18th century until the mid-19th century with the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Then it also had various activities in China via the Opium Wars that allowed it to spread its influence there. The end of the East India Company also acted as a way for the Queen of England at the time, Queen Victoria, to say that she was able to get that title of Empress of India.